Good evening. I want to thank the Boston Society of Architects for inviting me, Pamela de Oliveira Smith for organizing everything, and Gretchen Schneider for that gracious introduction. So today I'm going to talk about conceptual shifts in urbanism that I'm proposing, and I'm going to illustrate those shifts with several projects from literally all over the world. I'll be using a number of different terms, and there are two I want to highlight. One, probably the most important term, is urbanism, which is the city design and building process and the spatial products of those processes. This understanding of this phenomena that's both a process and product, I think, is really key to understanding what transformative urbanism is. Another important term is urbanists, who are practitioners that engage in creative, willful, and daily acts of designing cities. Conventional sort of understanding what an urbanist is would be people who are urban designers, architects, and landscape architects. We are all very familiar with the statistics about cities. About 50%, over 50% of the world lives in cities. Over 80% of the American population also lives in cities. And as we all know, these cities are economic engines, but I want to go beyond the statistics. I want to make an equally compelling but more nuanced argument for the criticality of urbanism. Cities are significant because they are the locus of people's direct engagement with the material reality of their everyday world. The material city not only reflects the underlying structures of society, it also serves as one of the means through which these structures of society are sustained and legitimized. Urbanists are the only professionals trained explicitly to envision the future of cities in four-dimensional form, including the crucial dimension of time. The urbanist approach, creative, integrative, interdisciplinary, and action-oriented, makes them among the most well-qualified problem solvers in the world, especially when it comes to one of the most pressing challenges of the 21st century, the making of cities. So while urbanists possess capabilities of deploying creative ways of addressing problems and shaping the material city, their often singular obsession with form and space also reduces their effectiveness. Such formal obsessions ensure that urbanists continue to be at the mercy of more powerful generators of urban form. What gets built is strongly conditioned by the structure and dynamics of economic and political power in society. How and where it gets built is subject to a host of laws, codes, standards, and regulations that reflect the interests of political powers and pressure groups. If urbanism is to be truly transformative, urbanists must also learn to engage with and challenge these deeper structures, even though such realms may currently be out of the comfort zone of the vast majority of professionals. My fellow urbanists and academics often bemoan the privatization and fragmentation of cities, but what they fail to understand is that this is perfectly normal in the capitalist economy, where land, buildings, and space are commodities to be packaged, marketed, sold, and resold at a handsome profit. In this system, investors and developers bear the immediate responsibility for the financial success or failure of a project. So this paradox for urbanists is that while their sense of creative autonomy and unique authorship is a great source of identity and pride, this same sense isolates them from the most critical decisions that shape their projects. So those with the most potent types of training, skills, and knowledge turn out to be among the least effective in coping with the urgent challenges of cities. To deal with this paradox, I propose a conceptual and practical shift in the field of urbanism to better fulfill its potential as a mode of practice and to make deeper and long-lasting impacts on the form, functioning, and processes of city building. I craft this shift by drawing from the work of pragmatist philosophers like Charles Peirce, William James, and Richard Rorty. As you see on the slide, the conceptual shift consists of three elements: city as flux, consequences of urbanism, and design as a creative political act. Tonight I will explain and illustrate this shift through a number of examples of urbanism. The projects I'm going to present are a mix of projects, including those that I've led, designed, or taught, as well as projects by others that I've researched and analyzed. I'm going to start with the first project, which is the Rural Habitat Development Program in India. Now, some of you may be wondering, what does rural habitat have to do with urbanism? Well, this is where I first developed and tested this approach that I'm describing tonight. The Aga Khan Development Network recruited me while I was still working on my master's degree in architecture in Paris. I conceived and implemented a brand new program to design and build rural housing in the Gujarat region of India. As you can see, the villages were small, remote, and had few resources. So one of the first things we did was to actually understand the reality on the ground. We documented and analyzed the existing morphology of the villages, including the design of public space and housing. So rather than begin with the preconceived idea of actually designing and building villages, building houses for the villagers, I persuaded the Board of Trustees to allow me to conduct extensive research to find out two things. One, what was the exact nature of the challenges and problems? And second, what was the most effective way of addressing those problems? My team and I, and that's me on the left with the beard, in case you don't recognize me, we spent a lot of time in the villages talking to people, immersing ourselves in the everyday reality of the rural environment. Beyond formal meetings, we engaged with communities by sharing meals and participating in local festival. In the foreground of the slide on the right, you see me and my colleague, a civil engineer, dancing during the Navratri festival, which was also a lot of fun, actually. We studied local construction materials and techniques, and this research really helped us grasp the changing nature of the rural environment, and resulted in a major shift in approach. Instead of designing and building houses for them, we would instead focus on their priorities and establish long-term processes to empower the residents and mobilize local resources. One of the first projects we were asked to do was to design and build a kitchen for a school in one of the villages. I worked on the drawing on the upper left-hand side while we were still living in the villages. Based on the research, I incorporated and upgraded local materials such as stone, tile, wood, as well as improved construction techniques used by local masons and carpenters. The first test of being flexible arrived very quickly. The village carpenters and masons did not read drawings, such as the one I had drawn, plans or sections. So we immediately shifted our mode of working on-site, as you see, well, it's a little dark, on-site on the upper right-hand corner with the village craftsmen, translating these ideas into three-dimensional, on-the-fly creative thinking. And the project turned out to be quite successful. On the lower portion of the slide, you see sort of the different phases of the kitchen with the finished kitchen on the right. Also in response to demand, we developed affordable housing prototypes that were durable, easy to build, and could fit on a very small site. So for example, the prototype you see there is only about 25 feet by 35 feet. The construction was based on local limestone that is very strong and durable, and added prefabricated concrete beams that are cheap and easy to transport. We worked with one village that had raised funds to build a new daycare center and used upgraded local materials and technologies. We spoke with teachers in the existing daycare center and used the model, as you see on the right, not just as a mode of final presentation, but as a conversation piece to generate debate and ideas. The point of this approach to design was to empower residents to help themselves through a number of strategies. And due to this highly responsive and open-ended approach, the program shifted increasingly towards the design of infrastructure. In a period of about 8 years, this program has been responsible for the construction of over 13,000 sanitation structures, such as toilets, bathrooms, soak pits, over 100 water supply systems, including rainwater harvesting, and over 300 other projects, such as kitchens designed to prevent the noxious smoke emitted by firewood. The flexible and changing nature of the program also enabled it to help with rebuilding after earthquakes in the regions of Gujarat and Kashmir, and after the 2004 tsunami in the state of Andhra Pradesh on India's east coast. So the first conceptual shift I'm going to talk about is this idea of city as flux. While the city may be designed, built, and experienced as a three-dimensional material object, the crucial fourth dimension of time requires that the city be more appropriately conceptualized as flux, that is, constant change, or as William James calls it, always in the making. There are two aspects of the city as flux: a short-term and more bracketed set of design procedures, and longer-term city building processes. Urban environments, structures, and spaces are continuously and inexorably changing as they are shaped and reshaped over time. Urbanists require conceptual grasp of flux in order to shift design thinking, to learn to be flexible, and to regard projects as thoughtful and adaptive experiments. Such an understanding of the city also leads to rethinking practice. I'm going to illustrate these ideas with three case studies: the Olympic Village in Barcelona for the 1992 Olympics, Al-Azhar Park in Cairo, and an experimental urban design studio that I taught at MIT. Design and planning for the 1992 Olympic Games in Barcelona has been widely hailed as a successful example. The heart of the project that I'm going to focus on, as you see in the center of the slide, was 2,000 housing units for 15,000 athletes, and on the lower right-hand side, an adjoining new port facility for the sailing competition. More importantly, the Olympic Village actually transformed the old industrial area of Pompidou and created a new waterfront. Here you see the famous fish sculpture by Frank Gehry and two office towers rising in the background. What I'm really interested in is the legacy of the Olympic Games, not just as a special event, but in terms of transforming the city. Here you see behind one of the office towers housing, which was originally built for the athletes and now is occupied by citizens of Barcelona. The pattern of blocks was inspired by the 19th century Barcelona urbanist Ildefons Cerda, and the project was much more than designing for a one-time event, both in terms of time and space. So even though this was designed and built for the 92 Olympics, there are actually three key dates which stand out. Starting as far back as 1976, when formal planning for this area was traced back to the General Metropolitan Plan. In 1979, the first democratically elected city council of Barcelona took office. If you remember, Spain was a dictatorship under Franco for a very long time. And then in 1980, Oriol Bohigas became the director of planning for the city. Here you see an example of the housing with the sidewalks and the tree-lined streets. Once you study the history of Barcelona, you understand, again, this is not a one-time project, that there's a tradition of event design as a catalyst for long-term transformation of Barcelona, stretching back over 100 years, all the way to the 1888 World's Fair. This is a linear park with the housing on the left, and further to the right would be the waterfront. So not only was it a very long process and multiple initiatives that brought this together, but after the Olympics, The design and building of the Olympic Village demonstrated Barcelona's capacity for urban planning and management and attracted many international investors. This legacy also spurred further investment in infrastructure, including the airport, the port, and high-speed rail. This legacy continues to this day. This is La Rambla de Poblenou. It's not the famous big Rambla, it's the smaller Rambla in what was a low-income neighborhood, and this has now become a part of Barcelona. The second project I'm going to talk about is Al-Azhar Park in Cairo. The origins of this project date back to 1984, when the Aga Khan Award for Architecture organized a conference on the subject of the expanding metropolis. The site was the derelict Darasa area, a 74-acre, 500-year-old mound of rubble in the inner city. While the neighboring district of Darb al-Amar was poor, this district also featured some of the richest concentrations of Islamic art and architecture in the world. The site posed several technical challenges. As I said, it had been a debris dump for over 500 years. Construction required excavation, grading, and replacement with appropriate fill. Over 80,000 truckloads of rubble and soil had to be moved. And in addition, as you see in this slide, 3 large freshwater tanks for the city of Cairo had to be incorporated into the park design. The park was designed by Sites International, an Egyptian landscape architecture firm. Most features of the park are based on the traditional use of public spaces in Islamic contexts. The park was inaugurated in 2005, over 20 years after the original idea, and continues to attract about 3,000 visitors every day. The legacy of the project reaches far beyond the park. 3 landmark buildings, the Sultan Shaban Mosque, the Kairbek Complex, and the Darg Shuglan School have been restored. In the low-income neighborhood next to the park, job training and employment opportunities were offered in sectors such as shoemaking, furniture manufacturing, and tourist goods production. Microcredit loans have enabled residents to open small businesses such as carpentry shops and a dry cleaner. Hundreds of young men and women in Darb al-Amar have found work in the park, in horticulture, and on project teams restoring the Ayyubid wall. The third project is the MIT studio that I taught. In a constantly changing world, one needs to develop modes of urbanist practice that are nimble and contingent. Added to this challenge is the fact that most urbanism is carried out in collaborative teams of different bodies of knowledge. To address these challenges, I developed this experimental urban design studio. I drew on my own training and public performances in Hollywood in comedy improvisation as one of the most powerful forms of creative collaboration. The challenge in this studio was to design a strategy for transforming the material fabric of an area near downtown Boston between Chinatown and the South End. A further challenge was for the entire studio to eventually work together as one team. This was done through a highly dialogic process in which individual design ideas and differing graphic experiments were contested, negotiated, and reconciled. Some of the individual ideas that you see up there include crafting corridors of identity, subverting control through material appropriation, and transforming highways into sources of energy. The team engaged in a series of comedy improvisation exercises that mimicked a dialectical design process. The hand sketch you see on the left represents team members coming together to debate key aspects of the design strategy, including a highway edge on the top of the sketch, and to the right, unusual patterns of pedestrian movement throughout the site, the introduction of water and natural vegetation in a dense urban setting. Rather than pursuing conventional notions of designing architectural form or planning land uses, the team developed a composite strategy. One of the most innovative products to come out of the studio was a dynamic activity map. The activity map is a fine-grained scenario of accommodating and facilitating a wide range of human activities that change over time. For example, as the nuisance effects of existing highways are mitigated over time, increasing numbers of people can reside closer to them. The studio provided useful insights for comedy improvisation for the practice of urbanism. These included building design teams as horizontal networks, developing design processes that are sensitive to constant change, and ways in which design innovations emerge out of group dynamics. The second-year graduate students in this studio all came with previous professional experience. They found that this approach to urbanism exposed the weaknesses of the ways in which design is conventionally taught and challenged them to be both deep thinkers and creative designers. Two of the students were members of the team that won the prestigious national ULI urban design competition in 2009. The second conceptual shift I'm going to highlight has to do with consequences rather than intentions. So rather than focus primarily on the intentions of design, what matters ultimately are the consequences of design, especially the on-the-ground effects on the surrounding areas and larger impacts on the future city. Fundamental generators of urban form are those factors that have a greater influence on shaping cities than conventional design interventions. Examples of such generators include political decision-making, the profit imperative, power structures that privilege certain actors over others, systems of incentives such as revenue generation and social prestige, and values such as commodification or democracy. These generators are more pervasive than design because they have a more widespread spatial impact and because they have longer-term effects. I will now illustrate these ideas about consequences with three case studies. The Pompidou Center in Paris, the Central Artery Tunnel Project in Boston, also known as the Big Dig, which I'm sure you all know, and the India Habitat Center in New Delhi, for which I was one of the designers. The case studies focuses on what is of consequence to the city in the long term. The Pompidou Center in Paris was built in 1977 and hailed at the time as a prototype of high-tech, flexible building. Since 1977, the center has become one of the most popular attractions not only in Paris but in France, and received over 190 million visitors. While the design of the building did inspire a generation of high-tech architects, such as one of the designers, Richard Rogers, but others such as Norman Foster and Nicholas Grimshaw, the real impact of the project is its accidental and surprisingly successful urbanism. The site of the project had long been vacant and derelict, as you see on the left. There are two major consequences of the Pompidou Center for this area. One is the creation of contemporary public spaces that are immensely popular and animated. And second, the economic revitalization of the neighborhood through investments in housing, retail, and cafes. The Place Georges Pompidou in front of the museum is noted for the presence of street performance, such as mimes and jugglers. In the spring, miniature carnivals are installed temporarily into the place with a wide variety of attractions: bands, cartoonists, sketch artists, table set up for evening dining, and even skateboarding competitions. The nearby Stravinsky Fountain features 16 whimsical, moving, and water-spraying sculptures by Jean Tinguely and Niki de Saint-Phal, which represent themes and works by composer Igor Stravinsky. They have become attractions in and of themselves. The edges surrounding the center also house a wide range of economic activities, such as shops and cafes. In fact, the Pompidou Center and the area attracts so many more visitors than was ever imagined that it had to undergo renovation starting in 1997. The second project is the Big Dig. The official name is the Central Artery Tunnel Project, which was conceived in the 1970s by the Boston Transportation Planning Review to replace the rusting, elevated 6-lane Central Artery. But it's also known for its incredible delays, cost overruns, and the poor quality of some of its construction. The question now is, can the Big Dig redeem itself? I would like to explore the answer by suggesting its potential as an example of transformative urbanism. Many of you are already familiar with the staggering scale and amazing complexity of the project, which includes a series of tunnels, bridges, ramps, ventilation shafts, and other types of infrastructure. The most obvious way in which the Big Dig has transformed Boston is by physically and visually reconnecting different neighborhoods and offering the city another symbol, the iconic Zakim Bridge. The experience of the pedestrian has become much better with the insertion of the Rose Kennedy Greenway. As you can see in this image, parts of the Greenway are quite well designed and used extensively. There are other benefits which have been studied and written about. So other benefits to Boston include acting as a spur for real estate investment and development, but also transforming Spectacle Island in the Boston Harbor from a landfill into a park. Perhaps the most significant benefits to the city are symbolic. It is indeed a remarkable, if in the end flawed, correction to the grievous error that was repeated in practically every major American city. Highways were built through the heart of the city, thereby destroying large sections of the fragile fabric. In the bottom quote, Brendan Hughes writes about how the Big Dig is actually a symbol of a transformed Boston, warts and all. I would posit that the Big Dig can still yield meaningful consequences. For example, my colleague from MIT, Mi-Jin Yoon, has designed a series of imaginative speculations for furthering this project. In this image, you see her proposal to make even more efficient use of a scarce resource, land, by occupying the fill with garages. The main point of my thinking and her imagination is that the Big Dig is not yet done and can continue to yield even more benefits for the citizens of Boston. The third project I'm going to talk about is the India Habitat Center in New Delhi, where I worked as a designer. The project is a very interesting example of redesigning institutions as a form of designing the city. It is a modestly dense complex of institutional and office workplaces, conference facilities, and libraries for 37 different housing and infrastructure-related organizations. A key design principle was to facilitate social interaction in a way that's actually productive. The landscape courtyards that you see here are also an example of resourcefulness in the sharing of amenities, where normally each organization and office would have its own parking, its own meeting space, and its own food services. At this center, they're all shared. We also designed a cost-effective screen to cover the courtyards to provide shade during the hot Indian summers, while allowing the breezes to flow through. Thus, the screen, the landscaping, and various forms of water work together to create quite a pleasant microclimate. I was responsible for the programming, design details, and construction supervision of one part of the complex called the Energy Research Institute. I worked closely with Dr. R.K. Pachauri, who was the director of the institute, and then went on to win the Nobel Prize for his work as the co-chair of the International Panel on Climate Change. So as a result of this creative political act of urbanism, the India Habitat Center has become a microcosm of the best that a city has to offer. This vital urban center lies at the intersection of intellectual discussions about cities and housing, informal exchange of ideas over food, a cultural life of music, dance, and art, and even in the lower right-hand corner, the creative energies of children and their drawings. The third and final conceptual shift I'm going to talk about is design as a creative political act. Urbanism can be practiced as a creative political act that relies on moral choices as guideposts for interventions. Serious moral choices, such as designing for profit versus designing for public benefit, cannot be reduced to such a simple calculation. Rather, these choices are discussions of what is actually worthwhile to do. Pragmatists think of moral progress as increased imaginative power. One powerful example of this increased imaginative power is for urbanists to engage in a dialectical relationship with the ongoing project of democracy, in which democratic procedures yield improved designs, but more importantly, the process of design strengthens democracy. For example, urbanists can conceive of projects in ways that contribute to the constant building and rebuilding of participative and pluralist communities. The making of cities is fundamentally political because it involves the constant identification of priorities and the allocation of resources within systems of economic and political power. Embracing the political in urbanism not only involves the design of form, but also direct engagement with processes by which urbanist values, ideas, strategies, and practices are developed and disseminated in collaboration and contestation with the larger society. The case studies here illustrate different ways of embracing political process and power and creating opportunities for empowering modes of urbanist practice. The three case studies are the Orangi pilot project in Karachi, Pakistan, the Viva project in Belo Horizonte, Brazil, and the Uptown Whittier specific plan near Los Angeles, California, for which I was the project leader. The Orangi pilot project started in what might be commonly called a slum of Karachi, Orangi, Kachi Abadi, back in 1980 as a non-governmental organization. And the challenge they faced was to provide sanitation. So they came up with an amazing system of low-cost sanitation, which was organized, designed, and built by the people with help from engineers, but it was mostly managed internally. And you see on the left what was the open drainage, now becoming underground pipes and sanitation system. What's striking about this system is eventually over time it came to serve about 600,000 people in this part of Karachi at 1/10 the cost of the municipal sewage system. But it becomes even more remarkable. What was a simple, low-cost, participatory sewage system has actually become much more. It has become a system of community empowerment, it has involved women, it has led to microcredit loans, housing improvements, and job training. So physical improvement has led to social and economic improvement. The second project is the Villa Viva project in Belo Horizonte, which is a favela, also commonly known as a slum. You see an aerial photograph on the top and a view of the hill and the housing at the bottom. What is remarkable about this project is, as you may know, there is a tradition of participatory budgeting in the municipalities of Brazil, where literally the entire municipality's budget is decided through participation with the people. In Belo Horizonte, about 36,000 people were involved in deciding what the priorities for the municipal budget were. And one of the priorities they came up with was to upgrade the favelas, and I'm going to show you one of those. So in this favela, on the top, you see an aerial photograph of the favela before and after, and the project here is a park. What's interesting about these parks that you see in the lower right-hand corner, they were designed to actually deal with the issue of water runoff during the rainy season, which leads to flooding and landslide. So instead of just coming up with a technical engineering solution, they came up with a public solution and created a new public space. On the lower left-hand side, you see it under construction, and the sequence, the before and after aerial photographs show how much more green there is in this favela after this intervention. These parks are also great places to hang out, so they not only solve a technical problem, but they become a place for social gathering. The third project I'm going to talk about is the Uptown Whittier Specific Plan near Los Angeles, California, for which I was the project leader. Our firm was selected through a competitive process to devise a strategy to maximize the potential of Uptown Whittier, which is a historic core of a city near Los Angeles. The first step in this project was to in fact design an intensive process of public engagement, which included an exhaustive series of interviews, focus groups, public meetings, site visits, and dialogues structured around analytical and propositive exercises. In order to give the overall strategy both substance and longevity, the final document was developed as a plan that was formally and legally adopted by the City Council of Whittier, and this is the formal plan. But what is interesting, and I've come across this in other American cities, is one of the most important problems people said they had was not enough parking. And of course, when you study the problem, inevitably you find there's too much parking. When people say not enough parking, they mean they don't have it at the doorstep when they want it and where they want it. So we came up with a parking strategy that became a leverage to transforming this part of Whittier. Here you see, again, it's a historic retail core. It's very famous for its local shops and restaurants. And you see a kind of grading parking strategy where the darker tones in the middle of the drawing reflect areas where the city could charge more money and then use that income to actually keep this area maintained and clean. A second part of this parking strategy was to take all these parking lots and put them into shared parking structures. And we came up with this typology, which is sometimes known as a wrap, but we called it a liner, where it's essentially a parking garage lined with stores, offices, and even some residents. So it's not this big, gigantic, ugly concrete parking structure, but looks and feels like a normal building. We translated these ideas into how it would look in the context. On the right-hand side, we showed examples from other parts, other cities, and on the left, a rendering of what this might look like in Whittier, California, as you can tell from the palm trees. But this is what I really want to show you. The most important document in this design was this. And what is this about? Well, one of the most important relationships in urbanism is that between design and power. During the design process, we realized that the most powerful person vis-a-vis this project in the city was not the mayor, not the city council, not the chamber of commerce, not the community group, not even the richest person in the city. The most powerful person for this urban design project was a bureaucrat, the city manager, because he literally held the purse strings. Therefore, we realized to make design happen, we had to address the city manager's concern by literally doing his job for him. As you see in this table, we devised a number of capital projects that were key in transforming this area, provided their locations and cost estimates, and here's where his job comes in: funding mechanisms and funding sources for those capital projects. I've highlighted one example of a shared parking structure and all the information that our transdisciplinary team created in order to make this design a reality. What mattered most in this design strategy ultimately were the residents. We found that our approach to community engagement resulted in creating a political constituency for urban design in the city of Whittier. This case study demonstrates the advantage of embracing the political in design by asking deeper questions about who has the power to do what in a specific context. These questions are essential for making design happen. This project was designed to be implemented even before it was completed, and that's what happened, and was recognized with an award from the Los Angeles chapter of the American Planning Association in 2009. I will now conclude with some thoughts about the material city, the power of design, and transformative urbanism. We long for a clear definition of what good, in quotes, urbanism is, and simple recipes for achieving it. But quality cannot be so easily measured. We can, however, identify some desirable and discernible outcomes of urbanism, such as the examples on the screen. A key aspect of this proposed shift is the ways in which new processes could lead to improved outcomes in urban form and space. First, we can vastly improve the process of urbanism itself to make it more democratic, open, and just. Second, desirable urban form can take many different guises. For example, a compact city is not necessarily a more sustainable city. The question is more of providing greater choices in types of urban form to better fit with people's needs and preferences. Third, the definition of what is a desirable outcome in urban form should be the product of ongoing social conversation in which urbanists can play a prominent and ongoing role. Of particular importance is the public investment in and public stewardship of streets, sidewalks, plazas, civic buildings, and parks. In fact, the public realm is so critical because it is by far the most significant amenity that a city offers its residents. The public realm is where urbanity, the best a city has to offer, occurs. Furthermore, private property has many advocates, such as property owners, investors, developers, builders, and lawyers. Urbanists can become the advocates and stewards of the public realm. Design is a much broader process than is currently understood. While the current culture of design emphasizes autonomy and authorship of the designers, in order to be transformational, it must be more collaborative and interactive. New political economic structures and design processes should be inclusive and democratic. That is, not only involve the broadest possible range of stakeholders, but more importantly, include those who are the least privileged. Design does not occur outside the political realm. Rather, it is integral to the political process of the city and its spatial political economy. And the city ultimately, as a whole, is a valued public asset. Design does not begin and end with the conventionally limited creative process that centers on urban designers, architects, or landscape architects. Rather, it is part and parcel of the city building process. For example, those with greater power have already made the most critical design decisions before the proverbial pen is put to paper, all without any input from those who are the most skilled to understand and shape cities. Urbanists can broaden the design process by bringing to bear the considerable critical and creative thinking skills to the larger city building process and its outcomes. The greatest potential lies at the nexus of the material with the immaterial, which is where the physical realm meets the non-physical realm. Urbanists can be fierce advocates of the city. This includes the creation and replenishing of political design constituencies and coalitions that will serve as stewards of the desirable city. Urbanists can offer informed inquiry, rigorous research, active public discourse and debate, and leadership by example, provided they have the courage to take the economic and political risks. Until we pursue such a transformation, urbanists will continue to remain at the mercy of those who have the power to truly shape our cities. Thank you. Yeah, I'll be happy to take questions.
I think this was a very inspired talk. The biggest challenge for us in the audience, I think, is to follow and keep up with the pairing of abstract concepts, politics, power, time, and make useful matching of that within the cases. I'm constantly, during this talk, trying to identify the moment of truth where improvisational skills, comedic improvisational skills come into play. And so I guess that's my question. Where does the comedy, the improv, which I think it's in the air. There's a lot of business schools and a lot of management types who talk about that as being the single most essential tool for surviving the world today. But do you have any examples where that comes into play specifically?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. Where do these conceptual ideas fit with the case studies? It's obviously, first of all, not a perfect fit. I think that's forcing things too much, but the case studies illustrate the ideas, plus it's a two-way dialectical process where the case studies then inform the conceptual thinking. Now, in terms of comedy improvisation, you're right, it's used for business all the time, which is fantastic because it's all about making more money. And I'd like to use comedy improvisation for something else, creating better cities maybe. So in the studio, one of the things, the number one thing that relates to comedy improvisation urbanism is creative collaboration. Of course, everybody knows that cities are designed and built in teams, but people see it as a necessity. How can it become a source of creativity itself? The thing about comedy improvisation, it is by far the most powerful form of collaboration I've ever seen, because essentially you get together with a bunch of strangers and create something out of nothing. So for those of you who may not know, in comedy improvisation, when I perform, we are a bunch of people on stage, somebody in the audience says a word, that's it. We have to create not only a story, characters, settings, but it has to be funny. And so you really have to think on your toes. So for me, it's not just creativity in terms of graphics and visuals and aesthetics and space and form, but learning to think on your toes, learning to be nimble. And in a world that's always changing, and cities which are changing very fast, in fact, they're changing faster than we can get a handle on them, this training really helps you. For example, we do some very simple exercises, is learning to actually listen versus just hearing. Learning to build on what the other person said. Because sometimes our human nature is to self-edit, edit others, think about what's wrong. I'm sure a lot of you are already thinking about what's wrong with what I'm saying. So how do you flip that around and say, okay, that's sort of interesting, how can we build on that? So it's a mode of practice which is very powerful, it's very flexible, it's very creative, and it's a lot of fun. So in this studio, the students were fantastic. I mean, they had never done comedy before, very inventive, again, coming up with characters, stories, setting, etc. on the spur of the moment. Any other questions? All All right, well, I'll be here for a few more minutes if you want to talk one-on-one. Thank you. Oh, you have one more question? Okay.
I had another question. First of all, that was a great answer. I love this idea, and I had never thought of it. The second thing is specifically about the city manager in Whittier. I think this is when I was trying to match up where power and money, where the opportunities are. How do we as professionals engage effectively in a realm where we are completely and hopelessly outgunned? I mean, money, if I was interested in money, I wouldn't be an architect. But so how do you gain the skills to effectively engage with the city manager?
Yeah, again, it's a very good question. I think it starts with a very deep self-reflection is, do we believe in what we are doing as designers and urbanists? And if so, do we want to make it happen? And I think most designers don't believe enough to make it happen, because it does require some sacrifice and being politically savvy. So in this context, we were literally at a crossroads where we could have said, okay, we've done our contract, this is as far as we go. I had never done such a detailed budget in my whole life as a designer. So we pushed and pushed and pushed and realized we actually believed in it, we really think it would make a huge difference, and that this was the obstacle to make it go forward. He kept up bringing numbers. He had another agenda, which I won't go into, why he wanted to block the project, and that we've seen that all the time. So how do we do it? Well, number one is, you have to be committed to it at some risk and sacrifice. We are not economists by training, but we are working with a municipal economist. So that's the other way you do it, is to work in teams and see where the knowledge lies. And the third thing was, how far do we go? I mean, I just showed you one table, but we literally did his job for him. I mean, like, I've never spent so much time with an Excel spreadsheet looking at municipal bonds, revenues, etc. But it was also good exercise for us, where we don't have these clean and neat boundaries like, well, we did our pretty drawings, there you go, we'll see you later. But we realized this was the additional step. And what is interesting is, I mentioned the award that they got. We didn't nominate the award, the city did. They liked the project so much. I think because we went that way extra mile, or way extra hundreds of miles really, they really took it on, and they could also see the connection between this powerful person who lives in the world of numbers and design. And we made that connection. We didn't wait for him to suddenly have the light bulb moment and say, oh wow, this is a brilliant design. No, we had to make it reality for him. Yes.
I'm Christine Moser. I guess you could say I'm an architect in training. I was wondering, you talked a little bit about economic gain versus good design, and that they're often seen as kind of mutually exclusive by the people in power. Mm-hmm. And my question is, are they really? And if they're not, then what can we do to kind of change people's minds about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a conventional dichotomy that either you work, especially if you're in a private firm or you work for a private firm, is it about profit or even economic survival versus sort of doing the public good? And the point I was making is that's a false dichotomy. First of all, it can be both, but the point I was making about moral choice is the larger question of what is worthwhile to do. So alternative modes of practice which don't always come up with those kind of false dichotomies. So that means exploring different roles that designers can play. I mentioned being parts of teams, working with nonprofits, et cetera, et cetera. But I think a role that designers really overlook where they could really contribute is to design the process by which design happens. So in Whittier, we spent a lot of time designing that very exhaustive and exhausting process. I was literally exhausted. Was it worth it? Yes. But yeah, there were days I was like, oh my God. But it was designing that process. So it's easy to say design should be inclusive, design should be democratic. most people don't realize how hard, incredibly hard it is to do it well. It's very easy to have meeting after meeting, people show up and shout and whatever, but how do you do it in a productive, creative, focused way? So that's where I think designers' creativity can really be applied. So there are kind of alternative ways of thinking and alternative ways of practicing.
Once again, please help me thank Professor Inam for this discussion.